Welcome to Co-Opinions. My name is Josh, and today I have a very special guest on. In addition to Brent,
hello,
I have Ethan on.
Hello.
So Ethan watched us stream Little Nightmares on PS4, and he actually had an enormous amount of insight and had the kind of opinions that we love to hear on this show. He had some really interesting perspectives on the different visuals and ideas behind Little Nightmares. So we thought, let's have Ethan on the show so we can talk about this incredibly unique independent game. Ethan, why don't you get started with where did you first hear about this game?
Well, I first heard about the game on the BBC Gaming, I think it's the Gaming BBC 3 sort of thing, and I saw it when they were doing the Gamescom last year, and I did a bit of research and I saw it was at EGX, which I go to with my college every September, and I saw it there.
Okay, so you actually saw it at Gamescom. Now that's interesting because I know Gamescom is a huge games conference over in Europe. For us, it's mostly E3. I try to follow Gamescom, E3, and what's the one in Japan? I'm blanking on that one, though. So there hadn't been much from this studio prior to this. Brent, was this the first? You actually heard about it because of me, didn't you?
Yeah, I first heard about it when you played the demo?
Yeah, when I checked out the demo, because it had a very Tim Burton-esque feel to it when I saw it.
Yeah, I'll give you that. It does.
It kind of had the stop-motion appeal to it with the creepy, distended characters. So, Ethan, what made you want to look into this game more?
It was that creepiness aspect, and I saw how it was very... I think there was something about earlier on that they were using certain mechanics, and I really liked the look of the game.
Yeah, the creepiness aspect was something you don't see a lot of games that can actually unsettle you well, and it was the combination of the helplessness in addition to the way they were displaying things, combined with just visuals that there's really nothing similar to it that jumps to mind outside of, say, Corpse Bride, Nightmare Before Christmas, Coraline, those kind of things.
Yeah, it's really creepy, and I like it was also the mystery aspect. Like, I saw it was the chef scene was the demo, and I thought how creepy, and I wanted to know more about it, and that's what also drove me to look into it.
Absolutely. It's funny you should mention wanting to look more into it, because my word, I normally don't call this out in the podcasts because, behind the scenes how the sausage is made, but Ethan has done an enormous amount of background work on this, just completely thorough dossier on the information in Little Nightmares, and it's fascinating to see the breakdown of how all these different aspects come together. But enough about that. I just wanted to call out because Brent, you gotta give it up on this, right?
Yes.
I would like to talk a little bit about the development history. And Ethan, I don't want to take the wind out of your sails on this one. Did you want to about the history of this game at all?
No, you go right ahead. It's fine.
Okay. So, this game was originally announced a long time ago by video game standards, in mid-2014 as the game Hunger. Now, I'm going to get onto a little tangent here in of itself, because it was renamed in 2016 as Little Nightmares. Now, why do you think they changed the name from Hunger to Little Nightmares? I have a couple theories.
Was it changed after they got publishing from Bandai?
Yes, it was changed after Bandai Namco Entertainment became publisher.
Okay.
I thought it was the association with the Hunger Games, the franchise.
See, that's what I read too. So,
I thought there's definitely the association with the Hunger Games, but there was a couple things that I was also curious about. One, I thought it may have been a little too evocative right out the gate, because for a game that has the undercurrent of hunger constantly, I thought that maybe if it was right in the title, it might have buried the lead a little bit, so to speak. So that was my opinion. And the other one, you can see this when you look through some of the concept art, is it says not to use certain images because of ratings, worries. And I was kind of curious if a game that was called Hunger might already be toying with a rating that was a little more aggressive than the teen they ended up settling on. But that was my opinion.
Yeah, because if you look at the original teaser trailer when it was called Hunger, it does look a lot more darker than the product in the end.
Yeah, and you can see that because with the early development pictures and videos, it seems a lot more explicit, and we'll get into this as we go through, because even there's only a few times in the game where the enemies do anything to explicitly harm you. So, to go with the development history a little more, so we'll give a brief rundown of what happened. The teaser trailer dropped in 2015. Bandai Namco acquired it as publisher and renamed it Little Nightmares. It was officially released in April of 2017, and I got the vibe that they wanted to make this game a big deal, because you saw a collector's edition with a 6 statue. You also saw the comic was released, or they announced the comic, and there was also, very shortly after the game was released, they announced in June of 2017 that there was going to be a 3-part DLC to expand it. So I got the vibe that they were trying to make a franchise with this. What would you guys say to that?
I would definitely say, yeah. I get that impression. I kind of wish that comic would still continue.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. I think it was they attempted to go really ambitious with this because of it was their first independent thing they've done.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you think? And here's where this is why I'm glad that it's coming out on Switch as well, because they seem to be advertising it very aggressively. Does it seem like the game didn't quite find the audience that it was looking for?
Yeah.
I'm curious if it was just an audience mismatch, if it was they were looking to advertise it the wrong way. I'm not 100% sure why this didn't find the acclaim that I really feel it should have. One thing, I think, because Ethan, you've seen quite a few Let's Plays of this, correct?
Yeah, I have seen quite a few.
Now, do you notice, not with the speed runs aside, that there tends to be sometimes little hiccups when people play the game?
Yeah, there are a few hiccups with people going off on tangents on certain parts, like overthinking on puzzles.
I think Brent, off the top of his head, can think of about 5 times.
Yes.
I just woefully overdid some puzzles. But on top of that, it runs into a complication that we've touched on in some earlier podcasts about doing 3D platforming well is a very tricky thing. In fact, when I played the demo the first time, I actually killed myself because I misjudged where a ledge was, and I jumped to my death. And that can cause some frustration. And you saw a bit of that in the reviews for the game.
I heard there was a game-breaking bug that if you jumped off, people would fall off the ledge and it would just crash the game.
And that really takes you out of the immersion.
Yeah.
But anyways, what I really wanted to focus on for the majority of this episode was this game told you very little. And though not a lot of people watch when we stream games, Ethan is one of the few. Appreciate it, Ethan.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. One of the
things sorry, you're welcome.
One of the things that really jumped out to me is how little they told you in this game. And I don't say that in a negative way. They intentionally kept it minimalist, and I am a strong believer in Death of the Author. Ethan, are you familiar with the concept of Death of the Author?
You're going to have to remind me.
Okay. Death of the Author is when the reader derives their own meaning from a piece of fiction, regardless of the intended effect of how the author originally intended it. So
yeah, I get that.
The idea behind it is that when we've been doing research, you can definitely tell that the developers of this game had something that they were angling for. However, a interesting approach was brought to our eyes while we were streaming this, and one of the things that we saw definitely was what the developers intended, and that was the journey through childhood.
Yeah, because when I was researching this, I read up on a few articles that they talked about how it was supposed to be a examination of the darker parts of growing up in childhood, or the fears you have as a child.
Mm-hmm.
So all the really fat, disgusting people that come on board that you see towards the end of the game, their representation of Greed, because one of the 2 articles I read where they had a interview, they talked about the idea of the mall also being a metaphor for orphanages.
Interesting. Now, so we'll touch on all these different ideas, but I know Ethan had a very specific imagery he was angling for, and we've also heard lots of theories about this. So, Ethan, you want to go ahead with your theory about the different imagery that this game evoked?
Yeah, so like the main plot points of the game are the hunger and greed, but the imagery is really 2 things that are like shown, which is surveillance and very Holocaustic imagery, like of the Holocaust and concentration and lots of other things like that.
Now, do you think that they intended to use the Holocaust imagery? Because, for example, very early in the game, you're transported through an area that is a room just full of shoes, and that is a picture taken straight out of old Holocaust photographs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the game is constantly reminding you that this is a very dark subject. This is going to be a dark game. Like, in the first bit of one of the first rooms you go into, there's a hanging body. That's not really meant to be a character or anything, even though they kind of flesh out in the comics. It's just there to make you know this is a dark game straight off.
Now, so do you think that there were intentional Holocaust parallels throughout the game to try and actually do a parallel to the narrative of the Holocaust, or do you think it was just meant to evoke the same ideas as the genocide of millions of people?
I think, yeah, it fills in both, but I think, like you said, there is the death of the author. People are going to look at this through a lot of different ways, and I think that was another factor that could be considered in this.
Absolutely. Now, Brent, it looked like you might have had something to add with
the comic.
Yeah, so that's getting way ahead of ourselves. I'd like to touch on the story of 6 and the idea as that progresses.
Yeah, you mean the idea that of her being 6 because the woman before
No, it's still way too far ahead. Right. So, here's a question that I've never really been able to ascertain myself. Why did 6 wake up in a suitcase at the beginning of the game? I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on that.
I mean, is the suitcase supposed to be how she was brought there?
I'm not sure. Like, is that how she was brought there? Had she been living on the mall for a while and she just lived in the suitcase she found?
I think it was like to symbolize that she's a traveler, like she was traveling, but it's maybe sort of reading into it. But I think it's to symbolize her loss. She doesn't belong in this place. Like, she really stands out because of her yellow raincoat and everything. She stands out from every other character of her contrast because of her bright colors.
And I do want to just point out, going back to the incredibly dark World War II-esque imagery, that's straight up Schindler's List move right there.
Yeah.
Making a small girl stand out with bright colors.
Yeah.
That is a move straight out of Schindler's List. So.
Is the comic, it's a prequel, right?
The comic? So, you've read all 2 parts of the comic, yes, Ethan?
Yeah, both parts.
Which is incredibly disappointing. It was supposed to be 4 parts. I'm personally hoping now that the DLC is concluded, we see the last 2, but they never gave an official cancellation, did they?
No, it's just postponed indefinitely at the moment.
Yeah, unfortunately. So I kind of took into it. It wasn't not a prequel so much as it was kind of happening at the same time. I don't know. Ethan, when did you think the comic took place? Because it has to do with 6, to our listeners, it has to do with 6, the main character, interacting with a lot of other children that she meets in the mall. Yeah,
I think it takes place, well, it starts off slightly just before, and then it takes a bit in between. So I think there was an official source saying it would be taking place sort of with the game itself. Okay,
so yeah, that lines up with what my assumption was.
Okay.
Now, Brent, you just weren't sure?
Yeah, well, it was because of the fact that she was talking to those kids, and it's not like you ever run into, other than the one that hands you food through the grate, and the other... Do you even see the kid that you play as in the DLC? I don't even remember seeing him.
Well, you kind of see him, because remember, in between parts 1 and 2...
Oh, right. He's in the other box.
Right, he's in a cage.
Other than the kids you see in those cages, you didn't see anyone else.
Yeah, you don't interact with anybody. So I guess it would make sense to happen before the game then.
Yeah, that's why I questioned about the suitcase thing, was because she's talking to them, listening and motioning to them.
Valid point. But anyways, so in the first chapter, you're never really in any actual danger except for one part semi near the end. Now, I haven't done this because it's a very obvious fail state, but as you're progressing along this chapter, you see a lot of very, very ominous imagery. Because, actually, now that I say it, you'd mentioned the surveillance before, Ethan. The first chapter is the one where you can get caught by the staring eye and turn to stone, correct?
Yeah, the first, and I think there's one in the second chapter as well.
And this is actually very well designed from a gameplay perspective, because you can see a bunch of stone statues recoiling in places that the eye is looking at, giving you the inclination that if you get seen by the eye, you will get turned into a statue. And this eye is prevalent through the entire... It's the icon of the maw, so to speak.
Yeah.
And you actually see some places where the, I guess, children... Who do you think drew all that graffiti? It had to be children, right?
Well, we did see some of those gnomes drawing.
Well, that's the same thing, apparently.
Yeah, it is.
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that is actually... Giant spoiler. This whole thing will be spoilers as we're delving into the game, but oh my god, now I'm sad again.
Well, they hint it like in the end of the second DLC when you look at the shadow of the gnomes in the hideaway, you see the shadows of the children.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I read that, but I guess I wasn't paying attention to their shadows.
I was focused too much on all the toys there and like the semi-happy spot there. But in the first chapter, unless my memory is wrong, is the first chapter the only one where you don't suffer from debilitating hunger?
No, you suffer through it in all of them, because as soon as you leave, just when you have your first encounter with the janitor, you end up with the prison kid and he gives you the bread.
Is that when he gives you the bread?
Yeah, I think so.
Bread grows... Okay, yeah, now I got the 5 things you eat. Okay, I missed one of them in there. So this is a persistent idea through the entire game, hence why it was called hunger originally, if I had to guess. Now, what do each of you think that the omnipresent hunger of the protagonist actually represents?
Well, it's kind of progression, isn't it? Because everything she eats progresses, and I think in the end they become closer and closer together, and she just can't stop in the end. Even like, she goes to eat the gnome, which is a shocker, and then the lady.
So do you think that running unchecked, Six would eventually become like the other guests? Do you think she would become a giant distended abomination?
I think it's possible, because I'm thinking back to the one interview I was reading where they were talking about how some of the imagery is about turning into an adult what you're afraid of as a child. And I can see that with the hunger thing.
Interesting. Now, what do you think about that, Ethan?
Yeah, I think you're right there with like the idea of it's kind of metaphorical for a child becoming an adult. It's the eventual acceptance at the end when she just walks through the guests and they just collapse.
So do you kind of get, and this is, again, death of the author, personal interpretation, do you kind of get a, like, working class, upper class vibe out of this, personally? That's kind of, like, the big eating the weak, the strong eating the poor. Like,
yeah, I can see it.
Yeah, there is that evolution, evolve or die sort of thing in it. Strongest will live and the weakest will die. That's kind of the thing.
And the only ones, and you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, the only time I could remember actually being violently accosted, like your character very obviously died, was when the guests grabbed you and ate you, which came as a shock to me.
Well, the chefs can cook you as well, can't they? They can throw you into pots and stuff.
We never saw that. That is a thing that can happen?
Yeah, if they catch you, they can put you in fish or meat, or throw you into one of the soup pots or the ovens.
Well, I guess that completely ruins any ambiguity about what they're going to do with you, huh?
Yeah, well, I felt like I read someplace when I was reading about, in one of the interviews, they're like, when they take the children, That's why there's all the toys and the happy rooms and stuff. And then after they get to a certain, how did it put it? It didn't explicitly say fatten up, but when they get to a certain age, weight, or something, that's when they make them to food.
That's a great question that kind of ties in with near the beginning of the game, we see the children in an orphanage-like area. You see a lot of kids laying on beds, but in almost the very next area, you see kids in cages. So is there something that has to transpire to take them from the orphanage area to the cage area?
Maybe escaping might be one, because, you do more children attempt to escape and you do see the janitor picking them up. Maybe that's like the moment they don't like where they're going, they have to be taken. And that could be as well metaphorical for the change, they're being put into cages because it's time for them to grow up in a sort of way.
Interesting. That was something I was curious about, because we're going to tie some of the supplemental material in real quick. And we saw in the comics, the way that all the children got brought to the mall was the children were overcome with despair, and a character who was he colloquially named the Ferryman?
He also had the title Fate as well, was his name.
Oh, yeah.
Was it Fate?
I think it's in the second comic they refer to him as that.
Okay, because I've also heard he bears a striking resemblance to a character from the concept art called the Wax Bellman. He's very gross. Which that actually brings up a different point, was that the characters, all the human characters, they're all very unique, but they are all super gross. Not to put too fine of a point on it, but for example, there's a character early on, the first antagonistic adult type character that you see, the janitor. Now, the janitor, he is very obviously blind. What is going on with his eyes? I always had trouble discerning that.
Well, like when I first saw him, I thought it was a bandage going across his eyes, but it looks like his skin has fallen down across his face. And you even see that in some of the concept art. You see him with the eyes, and it just looks like it's fallen down and gone across his eye level, and that's why he's blind.
So you don't think, and this one of all the adult type characters, he was the one who the least looked like he was wearing some sort of a mask. So you don't think he was wearing some kind of a mask, correct?
I think he could have been, but it's very hard to tell with him. I mean, he moves really fast, and you can't really get good looks.
I would definitely agree with that. Now, do you think there is any kind of a metaphorical reason why the janitor is blind?
It's possible what he's doing, he's blind to. Maybe some sort of kind of justice metaphors, because he takes the kids and he's wrapping them up and sending them on that conveyor belt. So he's very innocent as well in the way he acts. He's playing with the things that you see in the lair.
There is also the possibility, just to go back to the very passionate, very strong World War II imagery, there was a lot of people who claimed they were doing what they were doing without knowing the actual reason behind it. So, if the idea behind it was he was blind to what he was doing, that could be parallel to some of the people who committed war crimes saying, I didn't know they were war crimes, I was just doing my job.
Yeah, I can definitely see that.
Yeah, that could be like a very possible idea of what he is. He's the lower class, because he is lower down in the ship. He's the lower class that didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah, and he's explicitly called the janitor, too. So he's very much doing the lower class jobs. So that is, interesting.
He's got quite a lower class name as well. Apparently his name's Roger, because he's got that name tag.
Yeah, we're looking at that right now.
I got the concept art here.
So, anyways, you do, and you kind of, though this one might be a touch of a stretch here, he has those giant long arms that kind of, if I had to say anything tied into surveillance, you can be gotten anywhere, it would be his creepy long arms.
Yeah, I can see that.
Well, especially since you symbolically sever that ability.
Okay.
Not even symbolically, you literally sever
his door on his arm.
Yeah. Now, speaking from less of a metaphorical perspective, this is another one of those places where I felt that the idea outweighed the execution. because that was not an easy quote-unquote boss fight.
Oh, no.
It was not, but I can see why they did it that way. After you have progressed through the ship and severed the janitor's arms, the next area is the first time you encounter the chefs, correct?
Yeah, you encounter the chefs straight after traveling on the conveyor belt across.
Okay. Now, the chefs, this was a discussion that Brent and I had. These are characters who are receiving the parcels that the janitor had been wrapping up and sending along the meat hooks, and they are very obviously preparing them for consumption. Now, when I first saw them, I immediately thought their gross, flabby faces were masks, and Brent disagreed with me. Now, Ethan, what was your stance on that?
I knew they were wearing masks before the game came out because there was a PNG of that they did for promotion, and it had one of the chefs lifting it up.
So do you think that they're grosser underneath their weird hamburger faces, or...?
Well, I've seen, like, these two images that you see later in the game, and they look what should be the chefs, because they've got... The chefs kind of are looking to try and resemble what the guests look like, but I think they've got much wider faces, and the two pictures from the ladies' quarters that do kind of look like that could be what was underneath them.
Interesting, because I know it's interesting to me that there are two characters, if we're including the chefs as one character, there are two characters that are very explicitly wearing masks in this game. One of them is the chefs, and I'm curious if that's to differentiate them from the guests, and the other one is the lady. And the lady, by far, is the least ugly character in the game wearing her mask. So we'll touch more on the lady later, but I thought it was interesting that for a character... Because you don't see the lady until later, do you?
You see her at the start through the nightmare sequence, and then you also see her through one of the surveillance rooms as well. Like, you see her in one of the chair.
I think it's the exact last image when you press it the first time.
Before you start seeing the mirror in the surveillance room. So it's interesting to me that the chefs would be wearing a mask that doesn't really make them more attractive, it just obscures their features. So, going along with... Now, what do we think... How would you interpret this from the growing older perspective?
I'd kind of see them as, well, as Six. If Six was viewing these as, like, say these were, like, actual... Everything was a normal, and this is how Six is interpreting it. I think she would view adults as scary, and a possible chef with a knife is scary.
Oh, absolutely terrifying. The thing, Brent, you got something on this?
Well, I was trying to, possibly they're trying to fit in.
So you're trying to make them look like the guests.
Yeah.
There is, like, another thing that I've noticed is that there is a character that you see a portrait of, and he appears to look like a scientist.
Oh, the one with the question mark for the face?
Is that a...
Yeah, I think there is also, like, Holocaust imagery there in experimentation, like the chefs are a product of experimentation, because you do see photos that have been data mined that are of the chefs, and they're like his products.
Huh. So and I'll come back to this extensively later at the end of this episode, but I really want them to flesh out the world they've created here. Like, they have created such an expansive, unique cast of characters, but I digress. Going metaphorically, I thought if we're trying to compare these characters to someone who's growing up, it makes me wonder if the mask, if it isn't just the mask they're wearing, like, I'm wondering if the idea behind it is, like, the whole persona of being a chef is, like, what they're wearing there. But they do have the pictures of them also wearing the persona. So that does create a bit more of a stretch. But Brent is looking at some of the old-timey photographs right now. Yeah, the brothers being super excited to be chefs. So, those guys are gross.
They are.
There's so many.
It does state on the old official Little Nightmares website on their bio that they were born to be chefs.
Curious. That is very specific, isn't it? But as you continue progressing through the game, as you encounter the chefs, well, actually, even before that, when you get captured by the janitor, you get captured because 6 is starving, and this time she thinks a piece of rancid meat is acceptable things to eat at that point. When you are... Yeah. So when you're in the chef area, the next thing that she encounters is a live rat, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a live rat in the trap.
Yeah, a live rat in the trap. And this is kind of when I start... Don't get me wrong. The translation from bread to rancid meat, I knew this was already going in a dark place. But when... Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself mentally. When she went from the rancid meat to the live rat, I knew that for a game that was already dark, this was about to go to a way worse place. Are you trying to escape from the guests when the gnome offers you the sausage?
It's just after the swarm of them come at you.
That swarm. So we'll do things sequentially then. As you progress through, you see a bunch of rotund, grotesque guests getting off a boat at the oversight of the lady, and it appears to be to just gorge themselves on the food that the chefs have been preparing, with the janitor packaging all the meat beforehand. It's a whole connected system. As you are navigating in between these disgusting guests, I'm curious why, because sometimes they give you no mind unless you come right to them, but then other times, like as the aforementioned swarm, they just start coming at you like a giant, disgusting mass of humanity. Now, do you think you just caught their attention at that point?
Oh, go on, Ethan.
Oh, no, sorry, I keep interrupting you. Yeah, they kind of are on top of each other, which is a bit... That has its own possible... And they're wearing masks.
Yeah, all right. Got kind of an eyes wide shut vibe to it, I guess. Just too real. But, so you have just escaped from this giant writhing mass that's trying to devour you, and I'm curious if from their perspective you are if they're even able to distinguish, because they don't seem to actually, except for the part where they chase you, most of them don't go out of the way to try to eat 6. They just try to eat her if she is within arm's reach. So I'm curious if most of them even distinguish the difference between the giant fish and the child that they're trying to eat. Looking at it from the guests are supposed to represent some degree of greed.
I don't think they do.
Yeah.
Yeah. I find it really hard to say that they distinguish any difference between her and that food in front of them.
Yeah. What do you think, Ethan?
Yeah, I think there's they're just so in the moment of their food, but the moment they come across 6, they want to grab her. It's the best thing on the thing, but when it gets out of their reach, they just pull back into their food again.
I would agree. It does seem to be kind of a representation of short-sighted greed, pretty much instant gratification versus any work. Now, we do see mild contrary evidence to that with the giant mass of humanity, but once you get away from that gooping mass, which is so gross, you encounter these NPCs you'd seen through the game called gnomes. Now, gnomes are these adorable little jingly guys with cone-shaped heads who walk around all janky-like, and you can hug them, because of course you can hug them. So you encounter one of these little guys offering you a sausage, and oh my god, I don't think... Brent, can you do that?
She, instead of grabbing the sausage, she grabs the little gnome and just begins to devour him.
She eats him alive! Yeah. She eats little friend alive! And it gets so much worse later. So, this is the moral event horizon for 6 for me. This is where she's gone from a person who is doing what they have to do to a person who's doing what they want to do.
Well, and I think each piece of food probably represents that. Just morally moving away from the bread was pure. It was food, just normal food. And then each thing changed along the way.
So, Ethan, why do you think she ate the gnome instead of the sausage besides to break our hearts?
Well, I think there's 2 reasons. One is she had already progressed into, it would have been a it would have gone down if she'd eaten something like a sausage after eating the rat. And I think the other thing was that the fact that the sausage was kind of contaminated in the fact that it was possibly child contaminated.
I'd never actually considered. Well, but I mean,
the gnome is as well.
The gnome, yeah. So that was why when we progressed to the final chapter of the main game, where you actually enter the lady's quarters and you start interacting more with her personal area. This is where we see a lot of background pictures that give us some insight that there's a lot going on in this world that we have not been made privy to. That's when, correct me if I'm wrong, in the ladies' quarters, that's where we see the picture of a girl who looks very much like Six standing with the lady.
Yep, there is a raincoat one. There's a couple, and there's one also in the guest area when you turn the corner when they're stampeding against you. There is one of the lady with a girl standing next to her.
So I'm curious what exact trying to drive at there, because there is a huge fan theory that Six is actually the child of the lady. Now, Ethan, do you subscribe to that theory?
Not completely. I think there is evidence to that, but the comics kind of contradict that in a way, and I think it's just meant to draw parallels to both of the characters and what Six becomes at the end.
I think it's too easy of an explanation, personally. Like,
well, I still like what the developers said to the people who asked that question.
That is a valid point. So, Tarsier Studios, I guess that's how you pronounce it, Tarsier? Anyways, they allowed fans to submit questions for a Q&A, and by far the most popular one they got was, is the lady the mother of Six? And their response was, what kind of a relationship did you have with your parents that this is how you would see a maternal relationship? So I had to agree with them there. That being said, they sure have a lot of stuff in here a lot of evidence that the lady does have a child.
I think, like, the one thing, I liked the theory that she was 5, and that's why 6 is 6.
Now you're saying the lady was 5.
Yeah, the lady is 5. That the idea being that the reason 6, it's a metaphor for, because 6 is different, like she was, they're lofted above the rest of everyone else for being standout and all this other stuff about them. And I think it comes from the fact, like, the woman wearing the mask, I think, has a representation of this beauty that she thinks she has to have. She can no longer see it in herself because of the way everyone else interprets her.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that there were at least 4 more before her, the head of them all, as a metaphor for people who were lofted to positions of power because of being standout beauty and other stuff like that.
Interesting. What do you think, Ethan?
There is a portrait of the lady in the center, and then there are 2 figures to each side. So, but I think it's kind of like the Sith rule of 2 in Star Wars, in the fact that your apprentice will have to defeat you. You'll constantly find new apprentices until one kills you and succeeds you, and I think that's 6, and maybe that's why the other children are brought to the Mall that you see in the comic.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I see where Ethan's going with this, yeah.
That's a fascinating... Now, we're close enough to the end now that we can actually bring this together, because I'd never even considered that this was her way of choosing her successor. Like that, I'd never even fathomed that. And so it makes you kind of wonder how many things she manipulated to ensure the progression of hunger from 6 continued going in that way, because the janitor could have easily lured you into that cage with bread. Easily could have lured you into, and you see the lady around enough with enough knowledge of what's going on that I personally think that she was involved with a lot more of this game than we saw her in. Yeah, personally. Okay. So
in my essay I've been writing, I have noted that the person who was operating the surveillance could have been either of 2 candidates I have kind of written about, and one is the lady, in the fact that her eye symbolism is everywhere. She's the one running the Mar. It's like the eyes are her watching everything, and every camera is perfectly positioned to how you're playing the game. You're seeing it, so you don't see who is watching, but I imagine it is the lady.
So then, interesting. One of the earlier surveillance rooms, though, does have the lady it does have the ladies' room in the surveillance cameras. So what do you think the benefit of that particular surveillance room would be then?
I think the surveillance thing, I think it locks on to possibly every eye symbol in the Ma. And I think, the wallpaper had eyes on it. And, maybe mirrors are also, these things she can look through, and that the broken one she was looking at.
Now, okay, so we're almost to that point. Now, as you confront the lady at the end of the game, you use a mirror to kind of defeat her. Now, they hadn't given any indication other than the fact that she broke every mirror in her residence, that a mirror would be somehow her downfall. Now, we're going to gloss over that real fast just because this ties into the supplementary material. After you defeat the lady and she's lying there, you become overcome with the hunger. And I know for a fact you'll remember this, Brent, where I said, I'm going to eat her. That's what's going to happen here. And lo and behold, you had the growling in your stomach and you went for it. And as such, as you are exiting the maw, the disgusting consumer characters, the guests, they all reach for you, but you keep whistling your theme or humming your theme, and you use the lady's powers to kill all these people via proxy. And it's a very poignant scene because unlike the rest of the game, there is no urgency behind Six's actions.
No.
So what do you think that both her acquisition and her usage of the powers to get out of the mall, what was that supposed to... What did you interpret that as?
Well, I think that's her final point in that childhood to adulthood metaphor. I think it's the final embrace, and the sort of the casualties or the effect you'll cause when you're an adult and you have to embrace this dark thing you've become because you see adults as something you don't want to be when you're a child. You never want to sort of grow up, but you will eventually submit to the concept and eventually become that thing.
Right?
Yeah, I agree with Ethan. I also think from the greed standpoint and other stuff, like her taking over the woman's place was her ascending to that position.
So do you think she was intended to leave, though?
That one I'm not sure about. I feel like that her walking through them are like the masses wanting to be with her and her being too good for them.
Do you think it was being too... Do you think they wanted to be with her or they wanted to eat her?
They wanted to eat her, so they wanted... I think a better interpretation then is they wanted what she had.
Okay. Yeah, I could see that. But anyway, so you exit the maw and that's pretty much it. You see the gnomes that you hugged.
And didn't eat.
Oh my god. Well, on that segue, sadness. So they released a 3-part DLC series, and we have eaten up quite a lot of time, so we're going to move through this a little snappier than we did the main game. The DLC touches on a different character that was confined in the maw, named the Runaway. It was a boy with very shaggy hair, and the game starts with him swimming and being pulled under the water. Whether or not this is a dream sequence or how he was actually brought to the maw, never expanded upon. But what I felt the DLC did more than anything was help give a little context to the background events that were happening. It fleshed out some ideas. For example, especially the second part of the DLC, you got a lot more interaction with the gnomes. The first part of the DLC, I didn't feel like it did a whole lot other than to introduce a potentially antagonistic character. The grandma character.
Oh, yeah.
Well, originally, I think the DLCs were kind of rushed because there was pretty much only a month and a half of known development we can see. And what we can see because of the cut content, 6 was actually kind of meant to be at one point in the depths. And there was also meant to be a gnome mechanic in the game because you see her free a gnome from the glass jar and she bounces and it bounces. And so I think this is where they cut the content and they just put it out as DLCs.
So do you think that this had more to do with cut content than fleshing out of characters?
Possibly, and they recycled as well what they had and they couldn't put in as well.
Makes sense. And especially with the first DLC mainly has to do with you getting away from an antagonistic character as the runaway. The second one encourages you, it takes a different approach to it, and to be frank, I wasn't a huge fan of this approach. It kind of had a hub world where you had to go solve puzzles and bring gnomes back to finish up the DLC. Now, it did a lot to establish bonds with the gnome characters, which was especially hard-hitting when you got to the end of the second DLC, and you saw that they all kind of lived together and had their little toys and were strongly implied at that point to be children. So do you think, either of you, do you think this was a successful way to evoke a stronger emotional connection with the gnomes?
I think, yeah, they did a good job of fleshing out the gnomes so that you were more attached to them, if for anything else, because, they were adorable. But that was about it in the original game. So I think, yeah, doing the second DLC helped you gain an attachment to the gnomes.
Yeah, it kind of gave two things. For me, it kind of showed their function in the map, in powering the engine, and as well as showing who they actually were. And they also kind of represent the innocence in the world.
I would agree with that. And that is another point, kind of goes back to the rich versus the poor, strong versus the weak. This is almost a direct exploitation of the gnomes.
Well, and I feel like the entire story of the DLC is someone who tried to reach...
Someone who tried to get out and didn't.
Yeah.
So, yes.
It doesn't also chronologically fit the timeline as well. It's quite a bit muddly at parts, because, the first part is you go down into the depths and you see the sheeps being lowered, and then by the end you'll wear sixes. And then you're put on the conveyor belt, and then, quite far into that part of the DLC, you see Six in the Shoes, which that should have happened very not short after you were put on the conveyor belt.
I did notice there were some timey-wimey shenanigans there, but I chalked it up to a suspension of disbelief simply because I know what they were trying to do, and I kind of wonder, it did kind of feel like they were trying to shoehorn plot elements together at certain points, but I don't know. I just kind of accepted it.
The only thing I could think that could kind of fit is something I read about childhood and how children view time differently to an adult. You have to kind of imagine shopping baskets being piled up. When a child is 4, they view 1 year as a quarter of their life, but when you're 50, you view it as 1/50th of your life. So life is much faster.
I would 100% agree with that particular perception. But, so going into the third and final part of this DLC, just because I want to touch on the comics at least a little bit, is, to make a long story short, you go through the ladies' quarters, and again, we see a lot, pictures on the wall. We see, at the very end, we actually get to see the lady without her mask, in which she is just as ugly as everybody else. And her reaction very much makes it seem like she does not want to be seen without that mask. So why do you guys think she doesn't want to be seen without her mask?
Well, I think she's incredibly vain as a character. She smashed all the mirrors. She resides in a beauty. She brushes her hair constantly. But I don't think what we saw in the mirror is actually what she's seeing, because the animations don't particularly match up with her face. And I think that's how she sees herself, is a more of a representation, like a Dorian Gray effect.
Interesting. Anyways, so at the end of this DLC, 2 things happen. One that is very sad and one that is traumatically sad. You get caught by the lady, and black mist overtakes you, and you wake up and you're controlling a gnome. So I'm curious if that means that every kid who's tried to escape and failed got turned into gnomes, because we can see other kids are being eaten. So is it only the escaped kids?
I think it's escaped kids who are caught by maybe the lady, or maybe there is a class divide within the kids, the division of who becomes gnomes and who becomes meat.
Well, and sometimes there's not a division, as the traumatic part of this indicates.
I really like the Let's Play. The instant we both
God.
Instantaneously knew.
Not like this. Not like... God. So,
I was waiting for you on that bit.
Oh yeah, you're like, don't check that picture I just sent you, because what Ethan had sent over was pretty much a shot-for-shot recreation of the reactions that we were having as you progress as a gnome and you realize there is one supremely important gnome in Little Nightmares. And as you continue to progress towards this scene, it becomes evident that you are that gnome. You are that gnome when you come to this room and you see a sausage on the ground, and the sausage has not been taken up by another gnome, and 6 is not there yet.
And the other gnomes scurry away.
The other gnomes scurry away because someone is coming that they're scared of for some reason, and the camera just pulls out. You play as the gnome who gets eaten. Why?
I think we forgot as well to mention when 6 eats, there is a shadow version.
Oh, yeah. Remember? So we pointed this out a few times because I said, was that a dark version of 6? Yeah, every time she eats, there's a dark version of her in the room. Whether or not it's watching her or whether or not it's becoming a stronger manifestation.
That brings in an interesting... Like the whole part where, as this kid in the DLC, when you the rooms where the mistress is, those dark shadow kids, you have to kill off with the flashlight.
Yeah, that is an interesting point. So, do you think though, Ethan? Do you think those shadow kids are more representative of what 6 was what we were witnessing, seeing 6 eat, or do you think that they were something different?
Possibly, I think. They could either be spells because the lady constantly, you see how much she reads. She's obviously got magical abilities and she has those dolls around her. But it could be if 6 channeled that darker, inner me sort of thing, the Kermit meme. But it could be like what that will become. She can actually utilize that into a physical form.
Interesting. All right. So, anyways, that's the game as a whole. I'd like to touch on the comics now, because as a last aside, as the DLC wraps and the credits end, they show a image on a television. Now, it shows it looked to me like somebody standing there, but you couldn't see their head. What did it look like to either of you guys?
No, you go first.
I thought the same thing as you, just a really tall person.
Okay.
I kind of had 3 possible assumptions for it. Was either I kind of thought it was the runaway kid looking really sort of sad, he kind of looked to me like he had his arm holding his other arm in a really sad thing, and I thought, oh, it's his soul or something. The other one was, well, actually thought the Doctor No, but there's no evidence, or the Hanging Man, or the last one I definitely think it could be is North Wind. The reason I think this is, you hear crows in the background, and the Mar only surfaces once a year, and it's in the middle of the ocean, you only see seabirds, and I thought, that's kind of weird. So either this isn't taking place on the Mar, or it is North Wind, who has crows constantly following him in the comics.
Now, it's interesting. I'm glad you mentioned the North Wind, because I personally believe that the character we see is, in the comics, one of the short stories we see is the children. They are in a house of mirrors, and we can see there's actually some kind of entity in the mirrors that is preying on the children, so to speak. And that was, to me, almost crucial information for, I believe that's what the lady was so afraid of in the mirrors, because that character entity in the mirrors was showing them what they wanted to be, but it was taking who they were in the process. So it was kind of capturing them, and that's why the lady didn't want any mirrors, and the guy on the television looked very much like the entity in the mirrors. So...
I thought that entity could have been the fleshing out of that Hanging Man character. There's also something I'd like to note is when one of the children is kind of look like it's dragged into the mirror, he kind of splits into 2, and there is an image of the chefs pushed together, and they look exactly like that sort of imagery.
That is... That's fast. See, there's so many little details. You can tell when the developers are passionate about a world, and they are very passionate about this world. They created supplemental comics that fleshed out the ideas behind, because we saw not only are adults gross on the mall, they're gross everywhere. And the children on the mall who were brought there only seemed to be brought there when they were in the absolute pit of despair. So that was why, to allude to the North Wind before, I believe that's why the ferryman impersonated one of the children's sisters for so long, because he wanted him to have incredibly high hope for when the North Wind did tell him, no, your sister's been dead for ages.
But I do like how upset the North Wind gets at the fact that
the ferryman takes him.
Yeah.
There is a bit where I think North Wind, I haven't really thought about this, but when Six first enters the sleeping area of the children, the door slams with a breeze. Just randomly.
There's so many things that I want to know.
Yeah.
I mean, there's like a good detail as well, like you were saying, with the details in the fact that when you're coming on the meat hooks, you see the chef smoking, and then later on you see it when he runs after you, he sometimes coughs. Like, that's a really good detail, I think.
Oh yeah, the continuity attention they pay, there's so many little things that tie in together, both between the comic, both between the game itself, and there's a lot of supplementary material even beyond that. Like I said, they've had discussions to make a Little Nightmare TV show. I really hope that pans out, but we are definitely at our limit here, so I want to go ahead and go around and talk about what we hope personally. Ethan, why don't you go first so we make sure we don't interrupt you?
So there should be apology because I've been interrupting you, but I think there was a confirmed tweet that they were going to do more work, whether that was going to be Little Nightmares or not, but they have said that they will do something else if that's going to be a sequel or not, but I do hope we see another sequel or more DLCs.
Okay. Brent, why don't you go next? Because I know this game made enough of an impact on you as I was playing it that you actually are considering purchasing it yourself just to support the developer.
Yeah, for the Switch. Yeah, the TV show intrigues me. I really wish that the last two comics, hope that they get made, maybe. We'll see what happens. But yeah, if there's a sequel, I'd definitely be happy to see a sequel, but I'd also like to see what other work that these people put out.
And that's the thing about it, is that I really hope they finish the comic, but I really want to see why I liked the Runaway DLC so much was because it showed a different perspective on the same world. I would be really curious to see a game set as another persecuted child, but not necessarily on the Maw. Maybe somebody who was friends with somebody who got taken to the Maw. Like, I'd love to see different perspectives, because the whole world is terrible, is what they're getting at here. Not just the Maw. And I love...
It does say that the Maw is the least chaotic thing in this world, that the world outside is more horrible.
How insane is that? I would love to see more of this. So I personally hope we see more, and they can't announce new stuff soon enough for this. Yeah. And they have a very active presence online, so I'm hopeful. But anyways, gentlemen, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think I'm good.
Yeah, I'm good too.
All right, fantastic. Well, Brent, thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah.
Ethan, thank you tremendously for coming on.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for allowing me.
Oh, not a problem at all. Get online and tell us what you thought about Little Nightmares. Does this sound like a game you'd be interested in? Did you play it and there was something we missed that you are absolutely gung-ho to tell us about? Are we so totally off base on this that we should not have even bothered? I'd love to hear. But until next time, my name is Josh, and this is Co-Opinions.